Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Can Africa press conference. Good to have you all in this room. As we have this press conference, let me put this to you. Adaptation have not been or have been totally ignored and have not gained the attention that is needed. And adaptation finance is almost empty, but $61 billion so far have been pledged out of 2024 target of $300 million. Last year, 2023 Adaptation Fund was not even able to reach the resource mobilization targets agreed upon in the negotiations, with only $188 billion in the new pledge. It is very far short of the true cost of adaptation in the projected reach of $387 billion annually by 2030. So it is clear that our countries in Africa really are struggling to adapt to climate finance. On the panel today, we have distinguished panelists that will be speaking to you all, and then you can have questions after. Each of them will be speaking for 3 minutes. Dr. Ted Moyo, Director of EED Advisory, who is just joining us. Dr. Wafa, the Policy and Campaign Lead at Can Africa. Then we have Mariana. Mariana works as the coordinator of the Africa Just Transition Network. Sepad is the coordinator of Southern Africa Can Network. And I'm Mohamed Lamin Sedikan, your moderator for today. Let me kickstart with Mariana to give us why you think the 1.3 billion or 1.3 trillion for new climate finance goal is needed, and how it will impact on our climate fights.
Thank you, Lamin. Hello, everyone. I think the 1.3 trillion, the good thing is this is something that was agreed to by everyone, because we actually, one of the main things maybe some of you might not know is it was found that the $1.3 trillion is what is invested into hydrocarbons. And if this money is invested into hydrocarbons, and we have had discussions that we want to repurpose the money that is being used in hydrocarbons and using it to, let's say, renewable energy and the just transition process, then we have to make sure that we use that money, because if we don't have use for that money, then what happens to that money? It might go back again into hydrocarbons. So this is one of the main reasons why it started. And then we also saw the main need, because let's say for instance, the Global South, I'll use Africa from where I come from. With recent times, the impact of climate change is something that we all know about. But in Africa, I can just tell you so many stories. You go to Southern Africa, there have been a lot of droughts. And even in my country, in Ghana, the weather pattern has changed. A lot of people do not actually have the same pattern that they used to. Farmers are making losses. Food is becoming a problem, food shortage all over Africa. There's been droughts, there's been floods, there's been cyclones. You go to Mozambique, Madagascar, you go to East and West Africa in the Sahel region, we've had more floods than we could actually imagine. And even across Africa, you've actually seen floods happening in countries that we didn't even think floods will actually happen in. So this tells you that there's a need for us to actually have financing for climate adaptation, especially in mitigation as well. And when we talk about the climate financing for these, how do we get the money? Where do we get the money from? We've spoken about in the past like 100 billion, but we've noticed that this is not going to be enough. With the issues we are facing, with the people on the ground, when you go to the grassroots communities, what they are going through, we see that there's an urgent need for more money. And when we looked at it and we spoke about it, the discussions that have come across from all angles is that there's a need for for us to target the 1.3 trillion. And with that, looking at the fact that that is what is being invested into hydrocarbons, why can't we get that to invest it into the just transition, into the transition process as well, and climate adaptation, basically. So if we say that we are seeing how we can repurpose the finance that is being used for the hydrocarbons, and then we are also saying, we've all said we are committing to trying to make a change and transitioning. So if we are committing to it, then let's make sure that we get this money to be able to get to that cause. And so I think on the whole, that is one of the main reasons that we see it. And I believe that we've agreed to it and we want to see a change in climate adaptation and some growth, especially in Africa and the global south. Let's make this happen. Thanks.
Thank you, Marina. That's really very well clearly put out there. Africa is really struggling in terms of finance, but adaptation is critical. As I speak and moderate this panel, Senegal is actually struggling. And not only Senegal, but the sub-region in West Africa, the Sahel region, a lot of communities are submerged with flood. Communities lost all their livelihood through flood, fast flood. It's really alarming. The urgency of climate finance for African countries is critical and very urgent. I hope this COP will deliver and we whole leaders will listen to the voices of people from the global south, especially Africa. Now let's move to my friend here, Sepat. Can you break it down for us, the 1.3 trillion? How do we arrive to this figure?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that just moving from the 100 billion target per year by 2020, this was not achieved, but then probably achieved 2 years later, as reported by OECD. But there has been, a deliberate effort to ensure that we get the needed, funds that the 100 billion could not cover. Unfortunately, of course, the 100 billion was just covering mitigation and adaptation. But what we see now is, in addition to that, which is also the loss and damage. And based on this, there's been, studies that have been undertaken. And these studies came up with very, interesting figures that really speaks to loss of trillions of dollars, which is really, okay. So what has happened is within the three categories, what has happened is there's mitigation, where the expectation for such, funds has been, targeted to around 300 billion. And of course, in grant translation, and this is basically based on some of the reports that have been, done, as I mentioned, and as well, adaptation, same figure, 300 billion. This is basically a base figure. Otherwise, much more, is needed. And what is interesting also, that's something that we need to think about, is that this is not all about figures, but it's all, about ensuring that we save, people's lives. I want to mention that, adaptation speaks to this 300 billion, right? Not less than 300 billion. And, UNEP came up with figures between 250 to 387 billion. And this really, requires that parties or the developed countries really have to understand that, impacts are not going to be stagnant. Impacts are changing, they are worsening. And I always call them a moving target, but this target is not going down, it's going up, and we're always missing. So this is a challenge. Then we also have the loss and damage, which speaks to, around, 400 billion. Also, as a result of, studies, undertaken around 2019. So these figures really needs to be met. And I just want to mention categorically that the meeting that is just the G20 Rio de Janeiro leaders are really, as we speak, just a few moments ago, they've unfortunately, not they just failed to talk about, funds for the new goal, and as well as, fossil fuel phase out. So this is a shame. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We have seen the outcome of the G20 that calls for an immediate and needed finance to address climate change. But again, as you mentioned, some of the points that need to be addressed in the meeting have not been very much bold as required. But you said one thing that I just want to re-emphasize, that this climate finance call is not about money, it's not about figures, but it's about the lives of people that are on the line. It was the same for the world to watch Mozambique to borrow money from World Bank to address their climate disasters last year. So that's why the urgency of climate finance is needed for African people, because countries are not able to respond to climate crisis that they are not responsible of the cause of. Let's move to our next speaker, Dr. Ted. What should be the goal? What should the goal not have as we talk about climate finance? The lessons from the 1 billion target. Can you share with us?
Well, thank you very much indeed. I think quite a few of the points have been covered, but there are several lessons we can learn on what not to do. And one of the lessons is that talk is not cheap. While we are talking now, the environmental degradation and the social costs continue to ramp up. So I think one of the lessons we've learned from the 100 billion is, as we pledge, environmental degradation is happening at pace, and two, the social cost, especially of the most vulnerable societies, we are experiencing that we're bearing the brunt of that. Number two is that numbers lie. If we take the energy sector, for example, and we say, there were 1.2 billion people who did not have electricity, and now it's 600 million people. What quality of electricity do they have? Do we have a minimum acceptable standard of what these targets are? Which takes me to the third point of what we should not do. We shouldn't just focus on abstract targets or numbers. We should look at outcomes. We are sat here in Baku, and the last 3 COPs, developing countries have been coming to countries that have enjoyed the benefits of oil and gas. So it's almost an oxymoron to, on the one hand, vilify the oil and gas sector. And by no means am I saying that we should increase oil and gas. But we are seeing that the development that comes from the oil and gas sector or from fossil fuels happens at a much quicker pace than all these pledges that are being made. And so what can we do about it? I think we need to have real partnerships. One of the things that these 100 billion, which we've heard is not enough, should have is real partnerships. When we couch some of these pledges in terms of loans, it becomes extremely difficult. One, the debt appetite in developing countries does not exist. Number two, those countries cannot afford it. But number three, it becomes an intergenerational equity problem, because right now we are looking at the current generation is overtaxed and they're the poorest. If we saddle future generations with the burden of paying heavy taxes to repay loans, to sort the environment for whom their forebearers were not predominantly responsible, I think it's unfair. So we need real partnerships. What does this look like? Number one, we need not just governments to make pledges, but we need to include communities, we need to include the private sector, we need to include civil society. We talk about things that seem so abstract at the global level, but would people in a village in Costa Rica or Africa, parts of Africa, really resonate with this? The other thing is there is no panacea. There is no one thing that will solve this. We need better laws, and when the laws are there, we need better implementation. We need pledges and the money being deployed, and it being deployed where it's most needed. And then we also just need a suite of tools to involve people, and that's what's been said. This is not just about the environment, it's about people. And so I think we need real partnerships, and we need real transparency. So we need to integrate technologies, we need to involve young people in communities, and we need better laws, policies, and regulations to make this a reality. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Ted. I think the urgency is here in the face of everybody. The urgency for climate finance to address the needs of African people, but also for African people to respond to the catastrophes of climate change. Let me say that the loan mechanism and the loan strategies that have been used in the negotiations and in the agreements have not been favoring Africa. It's like kind of another rope of colonization, putting a rope on the necks of African countries by supporting climate finance through loans. So what is required and what is urgent for all of us to push for, and that civil society is demanding from Africa, is a grant-based finance. A grant-based finance that will be simply accessible to communities and also to countries to be able to respond to climate crisis that we are living the brunt of and not major responsibilities of, not major responsible of the crisis. Let me move to the next speaker, Dr. Wafa. Where should this money come from, Dr. Wafa?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. So before answering your question, I would love to shed light and highlight that the fact that we are here, we are discussing very critical and contentious issues, which is at the heart of COP29, which is the climate finance. So specifically, we are breaking down what it truly means for us to secure $1.3 trillion annually to meet the urgent climate needs for the developing world. The numbers, as provocative as they are not just figures, as it was mentioned. They represent lives, futures, and the possibility of sustainable development in the face of an escalating climate crisis. Under the UNFCCC, and as it was reaffirmed by the Paris Agreement in Article 9, developed countries have a clear binding obligation to finance the effort of developing countries. This isn't charity. It's a responsibility rooted in historical emissions and a climate debt owed to the global south. Yet, today, Africa faces an alarming financing gap. While we require $277 billion annually to respond to climate crisis, we are receiving less than $30 billion, which is frustrating and unacceptable. This last September, during AMCEN, which is the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment, the AGN took the stand to ask for $1.3 trillion per year. So now to answer your question. The answer is straightforward. The money is supposed to come from the global north. This is not about rhetoric, but it's about responsibility. The climate debt owed to the global south has been conservatively assessed at over $5 trillion annually, and the African countries cannot continue to bear the cost of a crisis they did not create. Developed nations must step up and meet their commitments, and we need this finance to be transformative, not loans that increase our debt burdens, but grants and concessional finance. So in fact, the stakes at this COP are very, very critical and high. If we live with an NCQG that fails to deliver quality finance in sufficient quantities, we perpetuate a system of injustice that condemns our communities to undue suffering. Developed countries must understand that anything less than a genuine commitment is unacceptable. So now this is a call for our African ministers and negotiators. We stand with you in this fight. You have the right and the obligation to refuse an inadequate NCQG. Do not dignify empty promises. If the developed nations cannot meet their obligations, let them go back and try again. We must hold them accountable. Africa demands justice, not charity, and this COP must deliver it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wafa. This COP must deliver finance now. Now we open the floor to journalists in the room. If you have questions for the panel, please.
Thank you very much. So some argue that climate finance campaign solely look at demanding for funds rather than addressing structural challenges of financial systems globally. How do you respond to this? And then my second question is, if this 1.3 trillion demand is not met, what's the fallback plan for African countries facing extreme climate impacts? What are the alternative financing mechanisms? Are there innovative models that can fill this gap? Thank you.
Any other questions? Then the panel will respond.
I'll start with the second question on what mechanisms, what alternatives have we got? I think the first thing that we have not done so far is properly value the conservation efforts. So we're looking at carbon markets that are not working as they should. So the carbon price should be as high as possible. That's number one. The role of indigenous people in retaining biodiversity. I mean, the statistics are startling. I know I said that numbers lie, but indigenous people conserve most of the biodiversity in the world, and they're less than, I think, 3%. So we need to value the efforts that have been made in the past and not just look at this, as she said, as charity. So that's one. We need functional carbon markets, both the compliance market and the voluntary market. But secondly, I think the other thing that developing countries, and we speak a lot about Africa, should recognize, nobody is coming to save us. So one of the things that African countries should do is create separate mechanisms internally to be able to address these things. Whether we're looking at things like the AfCFTA, which is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, whether we're looking through the African Union, we need to also show some form of solidarity from the global south in terms of addressing these problems. Because they may be global problems, but if we are waiting for charity or we're waiting for benevolence from other countries, I think we will not succeed. So I'll just stop there because the other panelists may have things to say.
We can all quickly share your response on these questions. 1 minute, so we can all have something to say.
So I'll begin. I'll take the first one. One of our demands, for instance, as Africa Just Transition Network is the need for us to simplify the access to funding for African nations. And we've noticed that there's a need for us to see how the process can be very simple. Like we already know, it's very difficult for Africans to have access to this finance, even the loss and damage one. Luckily now we have a new leader that is kind of based in African roots. We really hope that this process can be simplified to help especially community grassroots organizations to have access. When I come to the second question, one of the things that we also ask for is there's a need for us to now see how we can strengthen African leadership in climate fund allocation, like I've spoken about now. And then there's a need for a financial system led by Africans who would facilitate a more impactful, efficient, and culturally relevant use of climate funds. And they do understand the systems on the ground, the issues on the ground, and know what the money should be used for in Africa. We also are asking for promotion of regional and continental funding solutions as alternative. That is, we are not poor in Africa. We have solutions. We are going to try and find solutions within Africa, raise funds within Africa, create a fundraising mechanism within Africa where we raise funds within our continent to see how we can also help to fight these issues. Thank you.
You can go for it.
No, thank you. Just to highlight and remind the leaders, especially the Global North leaders, that, I mean, talking about alternatives, especially from the African perspective, for me, and also even from the, Ken international perspective, I think it is really unacceptable because for a long time, Africa has been paying for climate action with its own resources. What we are simply asking is for the Global North to just address the climate debt and just appreciate that something has already been done. Imagine, I just want to give you a simple example, like Mozambique. You heard about a situation of a woman who gave birth whilst she was on a tree, right? Before anybody, before Red Cross, before the donor comes, already the people would have done their part, right? So they just come in and just do the rest. So we've been using our own resources. But I just want to then come back and say, funds are available. It's a myth that there's no funding, right? Funds are available, but the unfortunate thing is, it's just being, it's going to, for wrong priorities. For example, funds are used to support wars at the moment, right? We know that military spending is high, right? But they are saying there's no money. Let be another war in another country, you see how much money goes there, right? So there should be money for climate finance. But also, the tax breaks from the millionaires, the billionaires, and as well as, the issue of, redirecting public funds that are being spent on climate, subsidies for fossil fuels, that can be directed for climate action. Thank you.
Great. So Dr. Wafa will wrap us up with responding to these questions. Wafa, wrap us up.
Just briefly, probably my colleagues already answered the questions. I will just build up on what was said. And I would say that we launched African minister letter that more than 100 African civil society organizations signed to refuse any bad deal for the insecurity. So we're not going to accept anything that is not going to be representing us. And we are very hopeful. We're still positive. The fight is still going, still ongoing. So let's just be together in this fight and keep pushing. And thank you.
Thank you for attending. Thank you. Thank you all.